Hello and welcome to R&R Resilience and Relationships. I am Stephanie Olson, the CEO and founder of the Set Me Free Project, and I am so excited because I am here with, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Rebecca Saunders, Director of Programming with the Set Me Free Project. I'm happy to be
Yes.
on today.
Oh, this is so exciting. We are finally doing some podcasting and I am so excited. So here we go. I'm going to let you start because you had a conversation with a mom that I thought was very interesting, and I think it's worth having the conversation about. So go ahead, introduce what we're talking about.
So, yes, I recently had a conversation with a mom. She has a young daughter, and there was a situation that went on at the school. And so it was a situation where the daughter had come home and kind of said, "Hey, mom, this happened,"
Yeah.
and didn't really know that it was inappropriate, but definitely raised some red flags for that mom. And so when she went to talk to the school about it, that's where the issues kind of started to happen. They were not exactly receptive to what she had to say.
Yeah, and
So,
here's what's fascinating, and we'll talk about what that means, not receptive, but I think that there is this mindset, and we've talked about this with human trafficking, we've talked about it with sexual violence and all those things, but there's this mindset of this can't happen here. And so, yeah, go ahead,
and that's
what you
definitely
say.
what she faced. And so it was very much, I mean, as she was even describing the problem, it was, oh, nope, that not here, not
Mm,
here. And it just so happened to be a private school. And I think that we see that mentality a lot with private schools, not all, but some
yeah.
have that, we're kind of shielded from any bad that could come in here. And that's just not true, unfortunately.
Right. And why do you think that? Because I've seen two different dynamics in private schools. I've seen that dynamic. And then I went to a school where we were talking about human trafficking. And because the administration was actually so well grounded and did such a good job at making students feel safe, the disclosures were incredibly high. Which is a good, it sounds bad. That sounds bad to some people, but that's actually a really positive thing.
Sign of trust.
It is a sign of trust. Yeah. So now going one step further, we talked about this that when the school was approached again and asked if they had been trained in trauma and trauma informed lens, they actually laughed, and it was as if they had, like, what are you
Why
asking me?
would we
That's
even need that?
why would we need that? Exactly. So what is it about private schools, or I shouldn't say private schools, this
It's
just
not just
happened to
private
be,
schools, but
it's not this just happened to be a private school. So what is it about schools or communities that are just absolutely not responding to the fact that they might be experiencing something that they need to investigate?
I think it comes from a few different places. And so on one side, I think it can come from just denial, almost like a
Yeah,
self-preservation. If I don't address this, then it's definitely not happening and everyone is safe. And kind of that
right,
wish that, oh, there's no sign of inappropriate anything around here. And just really comes from a place of hoping that's true.
right,
Sometimes
yes,
also, especially in more like private schools or organizations, that they think, okay, well, this is a poor reflection on us. If something bad has happened, even if it wasn't directly my fault, it's my
hmm,
fault. And I think that
right,
there's a little bit of fear that comes into
yeah,
play too of,
yeah.
I don't want to be associated with this. Maybe I didn't personally have anything to do with this, so I have to say it's never happened and could never happen.
Right. Well, and that, we have seen, I mean, all we have to do is look at the news to
Mhm.
see the amount of school administrators or school teachers or coaches or whatever that have been involved in inappropriate relationships with students and
Mhm.
have essay issues going on within their schools. You would think that just from a legal standpoint, schools would be more
You would want
apt
to address it.
to, yes, yes. So it's just an interesting dynamic because the importance of being trained in trauma And here's the other thing. I was talking to somebody else. We have this great opportunity to work with one of our local firefighters, and they put on this amazing camp for youth. And so Rebecca had the opportunity to do it last year. I had the opportunity to do it this year. And so we're working with 6 to 8 year olds in the
They're so
morning and then 9 to 12 year olds in the afternoon. And it was a blast. But here's what I learned really quickly. I'm way too old for that. They wore me out. There's a reason
a
you're a
lot of it.
grandma at a certain age, seriously. But what we started talking about was the amount of trauma that we can see from just a child in utero. If you've got traumatic issues going on, even before the child's born, it is going to create issues with trauma. And so that's why teachers and school personnel of all need to be trained in a trauma informed lens.
Absolutely. I think it's more of just, wanting to really support those kids. We talk about needing an
Hmm.
education in, child development. Well, this is
Right.
really an extension of that.
Hmm.
And, as we were talking, I just kind of thought back to a conversation that I had maybe a year ago or so with a hotel owner. And I know this is very different. You're probably thinking, how does this connect? But when I was doing human trafficking training for their staff, she had said, a lot of hotels don't want this training because it's almost like admitting that you have a problem in your hotel. And I
Yeah.
think that that's something that we really need to help just as a society break away from that. That,
Yeah.
it's being trained, having more knowledge is not a bad thing. It's actually a
No.
really good thing because you don't know when you're going to need to draw back on that.
That's right. Well, and going back to that disclosure piece, what happens, and you said it, when kids or when youth, young adults feel safe, they will disclose situations that they need to. And by disclosure, I should probably define that word. When we talk about disclosures, we're talking about youth or people who come forward and say, I'm experiencing SA, I'm experiencing human trafficking, whatever it may be, but I'm experiencing this and I want to report it to you. That's what we mean by a disclosure. So that can look like a number of different things. But in these situations, when we're dealing with something so severe, I think a lot of times people think, oh, we don't want disclosures. We don't want disclosures, and certainly need to be trained on how to respond. But disclosures mean that this person feels safe enough to disclose. And you said it best. It's that they trust that.
Because in reality, I mean, what they're disclosing has already happened. And so it's just, are they trusting you enough? Do they feel supported enough to tell you about it, or are they holding it
Yeah.
in?
Yeah. That's huge. That is huge. So did anything happen with this school? Do you know, with the mom who
Yeah. So what she told me is that, there was that initial conversation, and then someone a little higher up in the school called, and the conversation went about the same way. Just that that could never happen here. And of course, she got a little defensive because at that point, I think any of us would. And it
Mhm.
was just met with a little hostility of like, no, that would not happen here. Your child is making it up, which I find
Wow.
so heartbreaking, just that that would ever be a response. And that's the last conversation that I'm aware of. So
Mm.
she did take it up, to report it to authorities as, we need to, but I haven't heard anything else.
Okay, so this is why people don't report.
Yeah.
Because when they report and they're met with, this wouldn't happen, I don't believe you, you're making it up, whatever. If somebody isn't as strong as this mom was, who went and got, reported even further, and we don't know what happened, but this is what we see so often, and people are terrified to have people
Well,
think they're lying.
and in this case, this mom was reporting and trying to address it on behalf of her young child. But let's say the child's a little older. If they were having that conversation on their own, just, I
Yeah.
mean, it almost brings tears to my eyes thinking of how that child would feel. Of
Wow.
just, oh, you're telling me I'm not saying the truth, just, oh, I just hate that.
Yeah. I do too. It's horrifying, and I think that literally every school. And here's the other thing. I'm going to just share this because I talked to an organization at one point that was trying to do education about some of this stuff in the schools. And I asked that, and they were doing it with video. And one of the things that we do as an organization, we do online courses for adults, but we haven't found a solid way yet. We need to partner with somebody to find a way to do online courses or apps or something like that for youth because they need an avenue to be able to disclose. So to have somebody we could partner with to be able to achieve that before we even attempted that. And so I asked this organization, so how do you handle youth disclosing? And what do you do if somebody needs to disclose? And her response was, well, I assume the teachers already know how to handle that. And
They
and I don't
don't.
they don't, unfortunately. And I was like, well, you'd assume wrong. I probably shouldn't have said it like that. But the truth is, they
Well, and I
don't.
think that's a really common assumption that anyone who works with children, especially, is trained in these
Hmm.
things, and it's not required training anywhere, as far as I'm aware of. Or
I
I've seen
don't,
this a lot with
yeah.
ministers too. Of people assume, and
Hmm.
this is something that actually that mom was told too, that well, pastors know how to handle trauma. Well, they're not trained in that either.
Yeah. And,
Yet that's
and
what
it,
they speak out.
Right. And unless somebody is trained in that, and frankly, we should all be trained in that. That's
Mhm.
not something that's just limited to school personnel or to pastors or to, social services. We really should all be trained in what it looks like and how to handle it. But definitely those that work with the public. You have to, because and here's what we should probably define trauma. Um,
Oh, yes, probably so.
yeah, because I always say trauma is trauma is trauma. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of trauma. There's acute trauma that would be like a car accident. You have a car accident, now it's a traumatic event and you respond to that traumatic event. There's chronic trauma that would be something that happens consistently. So that could be abuse in the home or something like that. But then there's also complex trauma. And we see complex trauma in things like severe SA violence, especially in youth, human trafficking, things like that, that it's consistently happening, but then it's extremely severe. However, trauma is trauma is trauma. So what I might find traumatic in my life, you might not, and vice versa. But we all have experienced trauma, every single one of us. And so it's recognizing when trauma actually starts to overwhelm that individual and they respond to it based on their emotions and their physiological experience and things like that. Would you add anything to that?
I love that you covered that because I think sometimes I do forget that we may not all be speaking the same language. And so it helps to
Yes.
define what trauma is and what that looks like. And I
Right.
think so often, we think of that acute trauma of, okay, it had to be this big event. And if it's
Mm.
not, then this isn't really traumatic, or I'm just being
Mm-hmm.
dramatic. And no, I think it's important that we recognize that this can take on different forms.
Yeah. And different everybody's going to respond differently. I mean, how I'm going to respond to trauma might be different than you. Um, I remember I was in a car accident when um, my kids were little. I was taking my oldest to a birthday party, and she would have been maybe 5. So Tessa, my middle, would have been like 2 or 3 years old. And when the car hit us and we kind of veered off the road, and it was a traumatic event. Airbags, our car was totaled, but Tessa actually would not speak for quite a while. And it, it, and Noelle went off to the birthday party. Like Noelle was like, well, and so it affects us so differently, and our ages are going to affect that, and our experiences and all of that. And so it can look very different in response.
And there's no one right response either.
Yes, exactly. So, regardless of whether there's something internal happening in a school, every school personnel, every pastor, every youth leader,
Everyone.
everyone will experience someone who has gone through trauma. And if we are teaching them and we are in that situation, we need to learn how to teach in a way that doesn't create more trauma and impact them in a very negative way. It's
Well, and I
hard.
think that I don't know if I would call it the happy ending, but a bright spot in this, what she had told me is that whenever she contacted a different school trying to find a place for her
Mm,
child to go, she was asking some of these questions that hadn't come to mind before. As
sure.
we often do, things don't come to our mind until there's something that needs addressing. And so she's
That's
asking
how
these,
handbooks are made.
right,
An
exactly.
organization makes handbooks based on staff members screwing
This thing
something
is
up.
coming up.
Yes.
I need to handle it.
Exactly. Go ahead. Sorry.
So she was telling me that whenever she talked to this next school, it was completely different.
Mm,
And they also had not had training in trauma, but their
okay.
response was not laughter, thankfully.
Ugh.
But it
Which
was
is
more, okay,
what?
right? What kind of response is that?
Oh,
But they
geez.
were more of the mind of, okay, we don't know about this, so please teach us your child and how can we help support and work together. And I think at a
That's
minimum,
amazing.
that's what we should expect, right? Of even if you don't have experience with this type of trauma or trauma in general, like let's work together and try to
Yeah.
get that knowledge to support the people that they're serving.
Absolutely. It's really interesting because we are seeing so much coming out of schools, out of churches, we're seeing all of this abuse. So we're seeing inappropriate relationships. And I say that loosely, inappropriate relationships. It's so much more than an inappropriate relationship when you've got an adult and a minor. But even when you have a structure of authority over somebody, any sort of um, manipulation or any sort of coercion, whether it be sexual or whether it be, some sort of unhealthy, inappropriate relationship, that is abuse. And I think it's really hard for some people to see that sometimes, but we are seeing that coming out of schools, out of places that are serving youth, out of churches. And so we need to get better at being willing to recognize that we all need to be trained in this, and we need to be able to respond in a way that is healthy and safe and appropriate. And frankly, we don't want to cause more harm. We don't want
Right.
to cause harm. Yeah.
And that's something that I think even people with good intentions who maybe aren't totally aware of the effects that trauma can have or what a trauma response looks like
Yeah.
can do unintentional harm.
Right, right. Well, I'll tell you a story. So we got a phone call from a mom who asked us to come and talk to her. I think it was her stepdaughter and stepson, because both of them were doing dangerous things on social media. So the daughter was 14, the son was 15, and he was gaming. She was on social media, and it was pretty bad. We made a house visit, which we don't do anymore. And we walked into this house, and I can't even tell you, talk about trauma, just what was happening in the house. I mean, I can't even describe it. Aside from the smell of illegal drugs that were going on in the house, and the dirt and the mess, and it was traumatic. And so we wound up talking to these two kids, and the girl started to tell us that she was in school and her teacher put her hand on her shoulder, and she freaked out. And the teacher said, "What's your problem? You're just going ballistic. You need to go to the principal." Well, what she told us next was that she had been sexually abused by everybody in that home. And so, yeah, so touch is not going to be something,
Reaction.
of course. And so if you're a teacher or anybody and that's the response, which I would consider an atypical response. Some people don't want to be touched, so that's where consent comes in and we need to ask permission. But, even if you don't want to be touched and somebody touches you on the shoulder, you might just move your shoulder.
Wouldn't be
But
that big of a reaction normally.
exactly. So when you have that reaction, it should be evident in that person's mind, the teacher, to say, that was an atypical reaction. Something's going on here. What can I do to help this student? Because what just happened traumatized her further. And that's teaching in a trauma informed lens. And
A
how,
sign that support is needed and not a punishment.
yes, exactly. It just went further, this whole situation. The dad came in and just yelled at everybody in the house. It was a very reportable moment, let me just tell you, but a very uncomfortable situation. And what I really walked away from is we don't know what people are experiencing behind closed doors. And when we look at youth and what they're experiencing and what we've seen, just you and I, it's horrific what some of these kids are experiencing. And so to not be prepared to deal with children who are experiencing trauma is truly irresponsible.
And I really do think that, there's a mindset out there where those are those kids, but they're not the kids that I work
Mm,
with. And I think we see that more. I don't mean to pick on private schools. It's just the situation is what's fresh in my mind. But,
mm-hmm.
at that private school, I think that's the mindset of, well, they're not in foster care. They're not from a rough
Right,
family. I know their parents. So there's nothing that could have been wrong. But that's
right.
just not true.
It's not. Those kids. I hate it when people say that. There are no those kids. And if we only knew what was going on. In fact, this is kind of a funny story, but it was a really good experience. So one of my neighbors and I were talking, and I was talking about this very thing, and I said, we just don't know what happens behind closed doors. And we could look around at all of our neighbors' houses and assume the best because when we see them outside, everybody's happy or whatever. But when they go inside, we don't know what's happening. And it could be really bad. And she called me later that night and said, "I just need to ask you, were you trying to tell me something?" And I thought, oh my gosh, no, but thank
That's
you. Isn't that
respectful
amazing? Yes. Mm-hmm.
because that's amazing because that really, I know in your situation you weren't, but that could have been someone throwing out a lifeline.
Absolutely.
Help me.
Absolutely. And I think we need to be really cognizant of those things because it is tough out there. And especially, like you think about what happened during COVID with people being home and at home with their abusers and not being able to leave. We know that reporting of abuse in schools went down because it's schools who so often report. And so if school personnel, whether private or public school, aren't trained in that trauma piece, I mean,
Things will
some
be
of those
missed.
things will be missed. Yes. Yeah, things will be missed. So, I love this conversation. I love talking about trauma because even though it may not be the most, I mean, trauma sucks, right?
Nobody wants it, but we need to talk.
Nobody wants trauma, but we need to talk about how to respond. But I think it's really important, and we do that training. Those are things that we love to do because we all see it every single day, regardless of what it might be.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I wish that, it was a more widespread mindset that this is important, because just like we prepare for a fire, we hope we never have a house fire, right? But you have a
Right.
fire extinguisher. We hope
Yes.
we never have to encounter trauma, but we need the knowledge. It's the
Yeah.
same thing.
Prevention is so important. And you never know when trauma might hit. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's the other thing. And I remember you telling me about this mom, and when they called the school back, or somebody was talking to them, and they said, well, we do have pastors who are available if there's a death in the family or something like that. Well, if that were the only trauma, I mean, that is
Yeah.
traumatic, right? But if that were the only trauma we were dealing with, it'd be much easier to handle life, but it's not. And so who knows what could happen? So yeah, we all need to be prepared.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, to that point, just thinking from a school lens, there could be a student who has never experienced something traumatic, and the next time they come
Hmm.
back to school, an experience has happened. And
Yeah,
it's,
that's
yeah,
true. And they might look different. I mean, that's the whole thing. It's like, are you then recognizing, has something changed in that child? Did they come back saying things differently, or maybe going inside themselves, really isolating themselves, or dissociating a bit, whatever the case may be? All of those things we need to be cognizant about and recognize to see if there's something we can do to help.
and like you said, I mean, everyone will react differently. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the time, some of those reactions to trauma are just like
Hmm.
naughty behaviors. I don't even really like saying that. Like, those
Yes.
being bad. There are no bad kids, but
Right.
that kind of mindset of like, oh, well, they just need some more discipline because they're being bad today. Well,
Yeah.
no, maybe they're actually asking you for help in the way that they can.
Yeah. That is one of the things we see in schools, that when youth have experienced trauma, it kind of manifests in two different ways, or I'm sure there's 100 more, but one of the two major ways is they're the naughty kids, right? They're the troublemakers, and they get labeled as the troublemakers, and that is a problem. Or they're the kids who really isolate and just, I always call it go inside of themselves, because it almost looks like that. They're just going to be shy, they're not going to communicate, and but it can look like those are really common things. And but we see a lot of things. It can look like um seductiveness. It can look, I mean, it can look like so many things. And so we need to be so aware of that.
Very true.
Yeah. Yeah. We did a podcast a while ago on the sexualization of children. I would love to look at that again too at some point. But here's what I will say, all of you out there, we would love to hear your thoughts. We
Yeah.
want to know what you want us to talk about. And you suggested, Rebecca, we should send out like a survey or a form or
Yeah.
something, even on our socials.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because I mean, we could talk all day about some of these things, but if you have a
so
question,
true.
we want to make sure we're answering your question.
Yes.
So please
And
know.
I love that. And you know what else we should do? This is my thought too. Well, this is my thought. You had the other thought. Okay. So, but we could go live and publicize when we're going to go live.
That'd be fun.
And so then we could have people answering, you're asking questions or whatever. And so there's a lot of things we can do with
Yeah,
this that I think would be a lot of fun. And then it would be cool if we could do a call-in show, but I don't know. We have to figure out all of that stuff. So
it's like a good
yeah.
time.
Yes, yay. So I'm super excited. Rebecca, I think that you should tell people where they can find you.
Oh,
And I mean, all over the place. Where can they find you, Rebecca Saunders?
okay. Well, obviously, I'm with the Set Me Free Project, so you can hit me up there. I'm Rebecca at setmefreeproject.net is my email. But on my personal side, I'm on TikTok probably too often. So,
She's like an influencer.
yeah, little something. But yeah, on TikTok, it's that single mama with underscores between the words. And so you can
I
find
love
me
it.
there. Or I just
Super fun
gab
stuff
and
too.
gab.
You do super fun stuff. And then you can also reach me at stephanieolson.com. And I'm on TikTok too and all the socials, but I don't remember what mine or Stephanie at setmefreeproject.net. Yeah, we would love to hear from you. So yeah, tell us what you want to hear. You have any
It's
good tags? Get some R&R is what I thought of last time. I don't know.
ooh, I like that.
Do you
Get some,
like that?
yeah,
I like that too.
a lot.
So, yeah, because that's our resilience in relationships. So, I think that we'll do that. Let's do that as our tag. I think
Okay,
that's a good
I like it.
tag. So, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. Get some R.